So a lot of autistic humans will seem very normal to you or typical to you, right? But the effort that they have to put in very often leads to burnout, very often leads to depression, very often leads to diagnosable levels of anxiety, etc. and so on. So a hard work that comes into processing every element of existence, I think needs to be really appreciated.
What were the experiences that led you to working with neurodiverse clients?
My neurodivergent clients initially found me, I have no idea how. So the story is that something in my face or in the way I present myself or talk about my practice really attracted neurodivergent clients. And that was before I kind of labeled myself as a neurodivergent therapist. And that's when that relationship with this particular client group started growing for me. I'm a creative therapist, so I'm a qualified art psychotherapist. And if you look into like NICE guidelines, or basically if you look into what kinds of therapy or what kind of treatment one should look for if diagnosed as neurodivergent, whether it's autistic or ADHD, etc. and so on. Creative therapy is one of the types of therapy that are recommended, whether it is alongside the medication for ADHDers or whether it's a kind of singular kind of treatment. It is recommended somewhere there. So, you know, if you were to be a client looking for therapy, you're neurodivergent, you might somehow come across the idea that creative therapy might be for you. So maybe that's why initially clients started finding me as someone who might be able to help them. Realizing that this is what is happening and knowing that through my own therapy, starting to explore my own neurodivergent traits, I started to think a little bit more consciously about my identity as a therapist, trying to decide whether it would be of benefit to my practice and to my clients if I was to disclose. Kind of universally disclose that I am a neurodivergent therapist, and I decided yes. I decided this might be really helpful to quite a big group of people to know that I have that lived experience and I have that lived understanding of what it means. There is something to say for this kind of like seeks like situation. Around 2010, 2012, Dr. Damien Milton talked about this double empathy problem. And he talked about how autistic people are often seen as people who cannot build connections or struggle to make connections. And for Dr. Milton, it became apparent that it's actually not the problem of an autistic person necessarily. It's a problem of both a person trying to make a connection who's neurotypical with that autistic person, right? And he also concluded then that actually two autistic people will probably get along a little bit better naturally than a neurotypical person trying to get along with neurodivergent person. So I don't know. It probably is a mixture of factors, but overall I decided to identify myself as a neurodivergent therapist. And at the moment in my private practice, 99.9% of people are neurodivergent, of my clients.
What was that process like for you of disclosing that you were neurodivergent? Was it like a joyful thing? Was it difficult?
For me, it was easy. It was probably easier than to a lot of people to kind of disclose this label, really, purely because I've been in therapy for very many years throughout my training, after my training, and even before therapy, I've kind of really liked that one thing about myself, that I'm a little bit different. I've learned to live with that as something that's really positive in my life, in my little world. I very lucky, you know. Not everyone will have that experience. So I'm also very aware of that not only that diagnosis, but also disclosure can come with very different reactions. It can be received very differently by the person experiencing it, but also by other people that we disclose to. So awareness is there, hopefully enough of that, so that I can handle that safely for my clients and myself. So yeah.
Can you think of any specific examples of how understanding yourself serves your practice?
I make allowances for extended assessment period where, you know, I use my curiosity and my personal insight to shape the ongoing therapeutic process to my clients' needs, right? If my clients know that I'm neurodivergent, I think it leaves and creates more room for this conversation about the needs quite instantly. quite quickly. You know, I acknowledge, I know that there might be needs that I will not understand unless you tell me. So I open up a lot of those conversations to start in those initial sessions, you know, even following on from the consultations. I suppose I know what questions to ask, and I know that I won't be able to use the same approach with two clients, probably. You know, it's always a bit different. And I know that's for most of us, but this allows me to be so much more adaptable as well.
The word that's coming to my mind is permission. So it's kind of like you're giving them permission to be themselves, and they understand that because of your self-disclosure.
100%. I think that validation and permission is definitely coming through together with my disclosure. Yeah, it's this like, oh, if she's a therapist, right? If she says that it's okay to be neurodivergent, and you know, I also talk a little bit more probably about my own needs within the process. As in, you know, I will tell my clients that potentially I will not look at them during the session. You know, I will tell my clients that I might be doodling or writing notes during the sessions that they always have access to. And that's quite funny because my notes make no sense to anyone else other than myself, I think. But I had a few situations in which my client said, "Can I see at the end of the session what you wrote?" And I was like, "Yeah, of course you can. You know, I'm not writing anything that is not purely based on what we're doing here." And you know, my drawings also relate to everything that we talk about if I do any. So I make those allowances for both of us. And I think, again, that validates and gives permission to a client to also bring the same level of themselves into the session.
And can you share something more about your assessment period with new clients and the sorts of things you try to work out with them?
Assessment process is the same for neurotypical or neurodivergent clients in my practice. Valerie Hatland, who was supervising me, introduced me to this idea of kind of 3-part initial assessment process where in the first session, I asked my client about themselves, and it's a very open-ended question. You know, if you ask someone who they are, it's usually welcomed with laughter. You know, it's like, oh, I mean, I came here to figure out, you know, who am I? This is way too big of a question. And I'm like, yeah, it is a huge question, but what comes to your mind? You know, what's the first thing that comes to your mind when you are to introduce yourself, or where you think about yourself? Approach it however you want, but tell me something, you know. And straight away, we kind of starting this conversation, whether it is image-based conversation or whether it is a verbal conversation, because in art therapy, we obviously can use either. In the second part of that assessment, whether it's a second, third, or fourth session, because sometimes it takes longer. So in the second part of that assessment, we would think about the circle around them. So it's both what you have and the deficits, potential deficits, right? So like, who is there in your life or who isn't there? Who you wish there was in your life, right? So we're thinking about the circle around them. And then in the third session, I bring the earliest memory into our conversation. So I ask them to think about the earliest of early. What is it? What comes to your mind? Is it a toy? Is it a smell? Is it a person? You know, and we start thinking a little bit about the past. So for me as a therapist, we have a chance in that way to think about their needs very quickly, you know, in relation to themselves, the others, and where it all originated. Then we've got an opportunity to think about the topics from all of those categories that then might be our little anchors for our future work together. So I've got like a little mind map straight away of things that we might be willing to go back to, that seem important, that surfaced really quickly. And it was developed in that way for working with clients with whom we don't know how much time we've got together. You know, so this kind of work was developed to help the multidisciplinary team to gather as much information as possible about the client, but in a very kind of conversational, holistic way as well.
And what would be an example of a visual conversation?
It depends on the setup of our work together. At the moment, I practice online. So I always tell my clients that I come into therapy with my basket of tools. In person, I would bring an actual basket. I've got an actual basket. And you know, we've got toys, we've got different image cards, we've got all the different sorts of things, including art making tools. But in those first 3 sessions, I've got my Pinterest board. So I would start a session with the question, look through the images. There's like 400 images in my Check Me In board. My clients would just scroll through those 400 images and pick an image that in some way resonates to where they're at now. Similarly, when I ask them to introduce themselves, I can say, listen, pick an image that tells me something about you. Because often people would say, I don't know what to say. People would be like, or very nervously thinking, what is the right thing to say, right? Or whatever I say, she's going to make it into something really important because it's the first thing I'm going to say, right? And Carl Gustav Jung, who I studied and who is to this day one person that I refer to in terms of my practice. I say I'm a Jungian creative therapist. He saw creativity and image making and an image in general, he saw it as a shortcut to our unconscious. So when I then tell my client, instead of telling me, pick an image that tells me something about you, the images can take us really quickly somewhere that years of therapy could pass and we wouldn't get to sometimes. And for neurodivergent people who very often don't think in that kind of linear way that we're used to, that's great. It works. It gives a permission to think in their own way, to kind of go places that seem attractive. People with ADHD or people who identify as ADHDers would have an interest-based nervous system. So the attention, the focus will go to the things that are exciting, to things that are interesting, instead of the things that we should be giving a priority to, right? So being playful like that in a therapy session very often works for those people because they feel like they want to engage because it's fun or it's different or it's curious or it's in some way more stimulating than just talking.
What's a simple way that we can think about what it is to be neurodiverse as opposed to being neurotypical?
Nowadays we think about neurodivergence as something that is difference in the way that we see the world, in the way that we process information, in the way that we make connections with people, in a way that we deal with the stimuli that comes from the outside. Definitely not a deficit, because we could point out to deficits on very many different levels and we all have them, but it's definitely a difference. I'm also not 100% into this whole superpower narrative. I understand it's much more positive and useful for a lot of people who have potentially been treating themselves or have been treated as someone with a deficit or through that lens of a deficit to suddenly realize, wait a minute, actually it's not just that, it's also this good thing that helps me to hyper-focus on the tasks, that helps me to actually make more in-depth connections with people, or etc. and so on. But I think we need to balance this out, right? So certain characteristics that come with ADHD or autism, or even like conditions like dyspraxia or dyslexia, have potential of being seen as a deficit in a way, whilst others are amazing. They really make your life more exciting, make you in your life more able of achieving other things that people might be struggling with. Jungian theory says that we all more than just one thing. We're constructed out of many different elements. There are many different elements to who we are. And I think that's similar when it comes to all of those diagnoses or labels that relate to neurodivergence. There's more than just one way of thinking about them. Definitely not just a kind of deficit versus superpower way of thinking about them.
Can we look to some of the common types of neurodivergence? And would you be able to kind of give us a bit of an insight into what the lived experience of someone with autism might look like as opposed to someone who's not autistic?
When I think about autism, I usually focus at this particular person's way of processing the world and how all of that stimulate, therefore, and that includes people, noises, information. How is that kind of processed differently by the autistic person or person with autism? And I'm going to use this language interchangeably. So some people prefer the person first language, some people prefer the condition first language, but So when we think about how a person with autism or autistic person processes the world, the kind of some of the main differences are in the way that the stimuli might affect them. So whether it is the human stimulation, so whether it is a conversation or even somebody's voice, and how will that affect them will be very different, right, from how we get affected by all of those things. It's almost like that barrier is there even before the content of the stimulation or the conversation becomes apparent or important, right? How easy it is to single out one channel of communication or of noise that is coming into this person's life. Even before we look at the content of what this person, for example, coming up to an autistic human wants from them, the whole myriad of experiences that surround that will be received differently by an autistic person to how it would be received by a typical person. So let's say, right, you're doing your shopping. You might have headphones in, you might not. You might be listening to podcast whilst shopping. This is your normal experience, right? For a lot of autistic people, this experience is not normal in itself. So, before they even attempt a trip to a shop, an autistic person might need to go through the whole plan and preparation to help themselves through that. The overwhelm that comes from multitude of stimulation channels that happen in the outside world requires levels of preparation. So an autistic person will hear much more acutely the noises from the road, the music that plays in the store. They will be much more aware of people walking around them, touching them, or brushing onto them, right? They will be much more impacted by changes in their environment. So objects move from one place where they usually are to another place in the shop that might be extremely distractive for an autistic person. So all of those elements that almost happen before an autistic person gets into a one-to-one conversation or one-to-one way of communicating with another human already make the whole experience much more difficult for them, right? And then if you layer that up with someone trying to have a conversation and interaction with an autistic person, you can only imagine how already overwhelmed they might be by the multitude of those stimuli, and to add a conversation with someone on top of that might mean that autistic person might react in a very anxious way, or might feel out of their depth, might feel like they need to pretend very often to be someone that they're not. We talk about autistic masking, for example. So a lot of autistic humans will seem very normal to you or typical to you, right? But the effort that they have to put in very often leads to burnout, very often leads to depression, very often leads to diagnosable levels of anxiety, etc., and so on. So hard work that comes into processing every element of existence, I think needs to be really appreciated when it comes to autistic people. And that's the kind of main difference that I see when I think about autism and how autistic people have to very often internally deal with the world.
So if someone is struggling with managing life in the ways that you've described, what are some of the ways that you can work with someone to help them to, cope?
So a lot of the work that I do in therapy with my neurodivergent, also autistic clients, is that work around the recognition of needs. Is your need to go to the shop because you actually enjoy picking and choosing your tomatoes? And then how can you achieve that, right? Where does that negotiation of needs happen? How can we get you to the place where you don't necessarily have to always compromise, but maybe you can find ways of supporting yourself and your needs in a healthy manner? A lot of people who come to therapy for the first time come to me because they just had a diagnosis, right? They received the diagnosis and they're like, okay, yeah, I've got it. I've got that thing. I'm autistic, or I've got autism. Yeah, what now? It's like, what do I do with this information? The thing is, I don't have answers. My clients have answers because, as I said, this experience will be so different for each and every one of them. And they will hold answers to what it is that they need now from the world and from themselves to find comfort. You can't cure it. There is no medication. There is no treatment as such. We don't talk about treatment when it comes to neurodivergent conditions, really, most of them. So there are different ways that you can help yourself and make the experience of being alive a little bit more comfortable.
What's another neurodivergent condition that you are particularly interested in?
I work with ADHDers. ADHD as a neurodivergent condition is kind of characterized by that brain that's wired for interest, not importance. That's the kind of thing that I like. That's a lens that I like seeing ADHD through. There's that kind of love of novelty, and very often struggle with executive functioning. So memory, planning, organization, impulse control, all of those things will be affected if you've got an ADHD brain. So let's say, clients have problems with planning, and they tried the apps, they tried lists. Lists are a big one. They tried, reminders on phones, laptops, Alexas, Googles, and all of those things. And we have to think about what has been failing them and why are those things not working for them, and we try to think creatively very often about those. Use musical clues and cues for reminders, or for transitions, use visual clues and cues as well. So very often we go back to like this very, sometimes not, childlike, but also very engaged way of creating reminders or creating plans where a client really puts an effort and time into making them their own. And what does that mean to them, of this process of making something look nice or make sense to them, not to the universal human being that the app was designed for, right? So again, kind of going from the universal to very personal in therapy. A lot of my clients would take part in body doubling, for example, which are the sessions held online. Neurodivergent people meet, and there is specified time where they are together with other people, working chunk by chunk, time-wise, on different tasks. But by having that body double, being in the presence of other people who are working and focusing in that particular time, in that particular way, that brain, the ADHD brain, finds it easier to engage as well. So it's sometimes it's a multidisciplinary approach, multidisciplinary team approach, where there might be already working with a coach, they might be already attending groups, or I'm able to refer or to work together with other tools that are out there to help. So yeah, and obviously, we cannot forget about the emotional toll that all of those neurodivergent conditions will have on neurodivergent human beings. So obviously, like in any therapeutic world, we would work with that as well. But yeah.
Can you share a story that illustrates the benefit of a creative approach when it comes to working with neurodiverse clients?
One of those situations, or one of those things that I've seen multiple times in my therapy practice, is when the client allows themselves, again, gives themselves a permission to let go of their own self-expectations, to forget about what I might be expecting of them, and spend time with an art material. So very often it will be something very sensory stimulating, like clay or Play-Doh, or something that allows that kind of not fully controlled engagement, right? And very often from those sorts of engagements, tons of learning happen for the client, right? Autistic client might realize that they need or don't need love or hate. They might explore or find out that engagement in an art practice helps them to regulate to a degree that then they employ that technique in their day-to-day life. So I had clients who, after the sessions, purchased their own sets of Play-Doh, and that really, really does help them to remind themselves that they might need more regulation. Those non-verbal moments in art therapy very often are much more meaningful, oddly, than anything that we can say. I had also clients who came to therapy to explore potential of being neurodivergent or having neurodivergent traits. And again, through that engagement or inability to engage with more playful or art practices, they might come, or they did come to a point where they realized, oh, this is definitely worth exploring. I shouldn't be getting a panic attack from touching clay. And that has happened in the sessions, where many clients on many occasions explored a particular material, and the reaction, very visceral, very sensory, very kind of nervous system reaction, bodily reaction, was so vivid, so atypical, that it got them to the point of looking further into potential of maybe neurodivergence in their lives. So I think, yeah, those kind of nonverbal moments in creative therapy, which can really beautifully tie some traits, neurodivergent traits, and give some answers to clients quite quickly, are quite cool.
And if a therapist was to start working with neurodiverse clients as you do, what would be some of the challenges you would expect them to run into quite quickly?
Specifically, neurodivergent clients really make you adapt. Maybe less experienced therapists might struggle with that, of that letting go of what you've been told for a long time that's right and wrong. I allow my clients to potentially reschedule their appointments a little bit more flexibly, or how our appointments don't necessarily have to always happen at the same time every week, just because my neurodivergent clients very often have to adapt their lives and work to themselves, to their capacity, to their ability to engage with the world, right? I get texts that say, Polly, I just can't live today. I can't do life today. What can we do? And if it's a genuine expression within a relationship that we've already built, and I can trust that client, and it would do more harm if I was set in my old school ways of like, okay, you still have to pay 90 quid and you miss a session, and there is the whole then spiral of rejection sensitive dysphoria that might kick into for that client, and they might never come back to therapy if I tell them at that point that I'm basically punishing them for them expressing their need. It's a constant negotiation, and it's very personal. And my structure and my approach will look very different with each and every one of my clients, having in mind that there are some principles that I will not compromise on. I have to have my contracts with my clients so that we can always refer to that, so that rejection doesn't come from me if we need to in some way hold boundaries that might not be pleasant, right? The flexibility doesn't mean no rules. I definitely 95% of time finish my sessions on time. And as I said initially, I don't disclose much more, for example, than just the fact that I am neurodivergent. This is my client's space. It's about them. So there are lots of the principles that I will not compromise on, but there are some that a therapist who works with neurodivergent clients will have to think about, at least.
What are some lessons you feel you've learned in the last couple of years?
To be able to express your needs is usually a breakthrough in therapy for a lot of clients. When a client tells me, I talked to my partner and I told them that I just can't wash dishes, and it's not because of my preference. It's because even if I put 2 pairs of gloves on, which I also can't wear because I hate the feel of gloves on my hands, I just can't. It hurts. I can't, And it usually is that moment where a client realizes that they have needs and they can say what those needs are, is a breakthrough. And it's the moment where the growth will start happening properly. That can, again, permission is the theme today, isn't it? That when the clients in therapy start giving themselves a permission to be themselves is the moment where I can see that therapy has done something really good. And that we're going in the right direction. And also that, what I definitely learned is that you don't have to, as I say, as a therapist working with neurodivergent clients, you don't have to let go of a bigger theory. You don't have to let go of bigger principles just to make adaptations for everyone. So quite contrary to that, I very heavily lean on the Jungian principles of how self is built from many elements, right? From many different elements. And I use that very openly with my clients, and it's beautiful. And I love that I can do that. And this kind of academic aspect of being a therapist, that drives me. I love that aspect of it. I don't have to compromise on that to be a good, fun, sometimes, creative therapist, right? So yeah. And that's all the learning from my neurodivergent clients and my work with them, really. We're not just one thing. We can be quite a few things, even if they're, in theory, in opposition to one another.
What are the ideas from Jung that you share with your clients, and how does that help them to understand themselves?
Jung believed that there are parts to who we are, And he believes that we all hold many different personas, those different representations of how we show ourselves to the world and to people. So, today I'm here as Polly, the therapist, right, who works with neurodivergent people. And that persona probably differs a little bit. It's still the same human, but it differs a little bit to Polly that goes on a dog walk every morning and meets people whose names she doesn't remember, but she knows what their dogs are called. So straight away, it kind of acknowledges that there is more to us than just our diagnosis, than just, our one way of representing ourselves. Then Jung also talked about the idea of the shadow self. Our shadow very often holds things that we think are the negatives, the things that are holding us back, right? But Jung also believed that we can only fully become who we are if we acknowledge our shadow and integrate it. So, we can't get rid of it like a shadow, right? It's always going to follow us around, but we can change or adapt or help ourselves to see the shadow as an integral part of who we are. We can learn from it, and we can always also even work with it, right, for our advantage in a way. So again, working with neurodivergent clients, very often those elements of neurodivergence are reflected in the shadow, and we can start thinking about how to actually look at those from a different angle, different perspective. How can we help ourselves to accommodate and to make space for that so that it doesn't drag us backwards or away from our goals, right? And finally, in a little bit of an old school way, Jung was one of the first people in a kind of that area of psychotherapy who talked about the female and male element to who we are as well. So he talked about anima and animus that are also at play when we talk about all of those different things that make us who we are. And that kind of ties up with the ideas about the self-identity and all of those different aspects of self that might be quite archetypal. We very often work with archetypes in my therapy approach, because that brings in images and symbolism and looking at those different elements again in that more creative way. It also helps my neurodivergent clients because it's structured. So whether you're autistic or in any ADHD or whether you're dyslexic, etc., structure is something that can really help. Oddly, letting go of some sorts of structures helps in some ways, but adapting a structure that can help me as a neurodivergent therapist and my neurodivergent clients to kind of have a little bit of a sense of direction, or to bring and anchor us back to something is often very helpful. And because it's a structure based on many different elements, we can revisit those elements kind of freely whenever it fits, whenever it suits us. If we kind of put the center focus on the idea that is very Jungian, that we are just more than one thing, you're not just your diagnosis, you're not just your work self, you're not just your family self, and start thinking about those elements and integrating them into one human and seeing that they will fit actually, and they're all valid. I think that's a good way of looking at that.
Do you find support in supervision with the type of work that you do? Does your supervisor also work with neurodivergent people?
No. So my supervisor doesn't work with neurodivergent people. And it's not that easy to find many therapists and supervisors who work with neurodivergent people specifically. But my supervisor is brilliant. Hello. My supervisor is amazing and she's very experienced. And I think, it's reassuring to know that, again, that we've got very strong underpinnings. I think as long as we know that we're coming from that kind of strong structure, and when we have our safety of our clients in mind, we can adapt and we can shape the practices to their needs. But yeah, there is more needed. That there is more, I think, focus on working with neurodivergent clients needed in our training. And equally, I've just recently started a little peer supervision group for therapists, coaches, people who work in HR, mentors who are neurodivergent themselves and who support people. Because I think being neurodivergent, like myself, and giving so much to others can also be super draining. And so we have to remember that there's, neurodivergence happens on different levels, and understanding needs to happen on different levels. So yes, there are more and more groups popping up, community groups. People are seeking support on different levels, not only from therapy, but when you go on LinkedIn, you can see that people are creating spaces for neurodivergent people to share their experiences, to learn from each other, to find out what helped them, where to seek support. And yeah, there will be a lot of people who are out there and claim to support neurodivergent people and might not actually have skills other than their own personal experience, which I'm not trying to invalidate in any way, but I think it's important to do your research if you're seeking specialist support as well.
Where do you think it needs to go next? Like what are the next kind of thresholds of acceptance and understanding?
One thing is a systemic change in relation to female diagnosis. I think that's something that's not spoken about enough. Many girls go underdiagnosed still, whilst boys are so much more likely to be diagnosed at early age, because the schools will point out to their bad behavior, basically, mostly. It's very obvious. It can be very obvious. A lot of girls have a very, very good ability to mask in comparison to boys, and they will go underdiagnosed. And then similarly to a lot of my clients and myself, that's another one little bit that I do disclose, a lot of women might go and carry wrong diagnosis for years and years. Very often autism and ADHD in women can be misdiagnosed and medicated as depression and anxiety. And that's something that happens quite a lot to a lot of women. So that kind of systemic change in educating teachers and educating early years providers and schools and around the topic of neurodivergence in women and in girls, I think that would be something that I really hope is going to happen. I would love to see therapists being included in the diagnostic process, because at the moment, people who assess for ADHD and autism are clinicians. You have to be a mental health nurse, or obviously a psychiatrist or a clinical psychologist to be able to train and diagnose. The process can be very brief and not necessarily match the needs of a person that is getting diagnosed. I've seen clients who have been in therapy with me for years, who I was convinced show symptoms and characteristics of, let's say, autism or ADHD, and then they sit for an hour and a half in a diagnostic room and don't get diagnosed, right? And that always kind of ends with the question, how well can you get to know someone in an hour and a half, and how the diagnostic tools might need to be updated as well, especially to accommodate for adults. It's in the last 10 or 15 years that we started diagnosing adults. There was a belief and understanding that those conditions end when you grow up, So this is very new to a lot of us. And I think there is a lot of change to come in terms of how we diagnose. And I hope there is a lot of change to come because of things like our understanding of masking in early childhood, for example. There is very often a rejection of a diagnosis because the now 60-year-old client of mine doesn't remember whether or not or if they showed any symptoms in their childhood, right? Talking about autistic ADHDers, so people who might have a dual diagnosis, the diagnostic tools are completely outdated because they don't allow for the fact that one condition can be masking the other as well. So I think there is a lot of work to happen there when it comes to diagnosis of adults, of neurodivergent adults, and I hope to see that.
How do you think you've been changed by the work that you've done?
If it helped me personally with one thing, it's that I am even more so free in being who I am. I feel like it helped me to reach a level of unmasking that I wasn't maybe allowing myself before. I'm also validated, in a way. When people come and they come back and they come back again and we engage in that long therapeutic process together, it's even more so validating because I am not trying to be a therapist that I'm not. And people are okay with that.